So we're going to now talk about the role and style of the OD practitioner, and we're really moving into the second part of the 5 stages of OD, and that's creating the actual team itself that's going to work on organizational development. So we're going to talk a little bit about internal versus external OD practitioners. We're also going to talk about a couple of models of kind of thinking about what is the style of the actual practitioner, and organizations are going to differ in who actually is an OD practitioner. And I really want to kind of focus for a moment on the idea that this is kind of an amorphous role. Sometimes the OD practitioner may be top management themselves, that they are driving the intervention and actually doing the interventions. Usually, though, what we're looking at is that top management is often going to be a stakeholder in the process. So they're wanting to get information, they're wanting to be directive, but they're not actually the team leader or the person in charge of the tasks of actually creating change in the organization. Wherever those decision-making elements lie within the organization, that's usually what we're talking about as far as OD practitioners. Another thing is that OD practitioners are often not going to be the ones that are actually the hands-on users of the intervention. So basically, kind of think of the process as having three broad groups. You have the actual top decision makers who hopefully have recognized a need for organizational development, a need for positive change in a meaningful and planful way. You have the OD practitioners, the people that are going to be going through the process we've been talking about in this class. So kind of identifying need for change, barriers to change, deciding on what interventions would best result in the changes the organization is looking for, how to create a culture of change. And then they're going to create interventions that are meant to directly change the attitudes and behaviors of people in the organization, the structures of the organization, or the process of the organization. Now, those plans or interventions are then going to be implemented usually by mid-level management, HR professionals, the people that actually do the business on the day-to-day level. So it's kind of a three-stage process. And what we're really talking about here is identifying who is in the role of OD practitioner and what does that role look like. So again, as a reminder of our 5 stages of OD, we've kind of moving away from now that first stage, which is anticipating the need for change and identifying or measuring how much resistance culture there will be to that change moving forward. We're now moving into developing the practitioner-client relationship stage 2. I think this is also a good time to stop for just a second and also reiterate or maybe state very clearly that what we're covering in this class is how to optimally do OD under perfect circumstances. In other words, this really is a let's talk about how it's the best way, best practices to do OD. And it is often brought up that not all situations are going to allow perfect organizational development. So a very hyper turbulent situation, a massive sudden change in the legislation or laws that govern the business the organization is doing may throw us from OD to OT, organizational transformation. It's one of the reasons we talk about the difference, that we're striving to do organizational development. We're wanting to create a culture in the organization that welcomes substantial but meaningful and purposeful change in reaction or in pre-action or predicting future changes in the environment to allow the organization to develop, to grow. However, even with a good OD system in place, there are going to be times where you're going to find yourself slipping more into an organizational transformation, that sudden and immediate need for changes in a less planningful and meaningful way. I think the main thing to kind of conceptualize here is some people may then ask, well, why don't we just focus on OT? We don't need to do anything unless there's something dramatic, and then we do it. Well, the problem with that is that means that the only way the organization can develop is through traumatic transformation in a stressed situation. And ideally, most situations hopefully will be more purposeful planned if an OD plan is in place. So without an OD plan, the only thing you can do is OT. If you have a good OD plan, if you have a good OD culture, environment, department, or at least plan, then in many situations you may predict a behavior or predict an environmental change before the need for dramatic and often just chaotic change. So OD is insurance against having to make sudden decisions, sudden changes in many situations. And that's really what we're wanting to focus on again. But I want you to keep in mind that at all times, this is what to do in the very best of situations, what you're ideally wanting to do, what is the best way to actually change organizations. And when I say best, I also want to focus on that just for a second. What research has found, and we have about 50 plus years of research on OD interventions, is that change is always going to be somewhat traumatic. It is less traumatic when it is done meaningfully and predictively. In other words, reacting to a future concern, changing the organization before there's a crisis, that usually minimizes almost all of the negative outcomes of sudden change. And those negative outcomes include a reduction in morale, a reduction in production and performance, usually a fairly large increase in turnover. So all of those are negative effects that often occur with change, and doing OD can reduce those effects. So again, just reiterating, the two types of change in organization can be random or haphazard, forced on an organization by external environmental events and not prepared for, what we often refer to as being in an organizational transformational mode, compared to deliberate attempts to modify the organization in a predictive way, and I keep using the word purposeful and planful. In other words, giving the change the time it needs to be developed and implemented in the least stressful way for the organization, and in a way where we know what we're doing and why, and we're actually able to measure outcomes to find out, is it actually working? And a lot of those elements disappear in organizational transformation. If it's not prepared for and it's being forced, we probably are not able to do a really in-depth dive of what are we trying to do. We usually can't think about how do we use these changes, how do we do this intervention in a meaningful and planful way, and we often aren't really even in a good position to do pre-testing and post-testing to find out, is the intervention actually working? We find out if the intervention works by basically if the company succeeds or fails, and that's a pretty poor bar to be using if you can avoid it. So I want to talk about the two types of practitioners, external versus internal, and just briefly go over kind of the advantages and disadvantages of each. And you'll actually find both internal practitioners and external practitioners in some form or another in many organizations if they start to adapt kind of an OD culture. So an external practitioner is usually not previously associated with the client, or if they've worked with the client before, it's always been on a contractual basis on single projects. The big advantage of an external practitioner is it allows a different viewpoint and more objectivity. So the person coming in as an external practitioner usually is able to actually distance themselves from it's the way we've always done thinking, is able to actually look a little bit more objectively at what the competition looks like, what that external environment looks like, because they have an external viewpoint. They're also not dependent on the organization itself. And that can also be a bit of a disadvantage, but that does mean that they are not tied into the actual structure of the organization and also the decision-making of the organization, specifically their own career. So they'll usually be brought in a very specific contract with very specific goals and objectives that they need to obtain. So they're connected to the organization, but their future careers are not based on what they do. So they're not having to necessarily be as political as someone that might be internal. The disadvantages is as an external practitioner comes in and needs to do a fair amount of learning to begin with. So they are unfamiliar with the organization. They don't know things have always been done, maybe why. They're unfamiliar with the culture, communication, power systems, and a lot of the informal or norms in the organization are things that they're either going to be unaware of initially or things they're going to have to really work on to develop their knowledge of. By contrast, there's the internal practitioner. They're members of the organization. The advantages here is there's no homework generally to be done. They're familiar with the culture and norms. They know the power structure. They understand the organization, and they have a personal interest in the organization. So they have a stake in seeing that the organization does well. The disadvantages, the first one is a lot of internal practitioners are not necessarily trained organizational development professionals. And I don't want to necessarily overstress that concept, but there are people that have had full master's or professional degrees and even sometimes PhDs, which means 2 to 5 years of very selective study and applied research or applied education in how to do OD. So I'm teaching this one single class in organizational development, but my graduate program actually involved no less than 9 classes that in one way or another were focused on learning individual parts of what I'm now teaching as one broad class. Additionally, while I was doing that as a graduate student, I also was consulting in a student-run consulting firm that was ran by the department, the faculty in the department where I got my graduate degree from. And then since then, I've worked as an external practitioner doing organizational development for almost a decade now. So that means that I have a lot of specialized skills, a lot of specifically educated skills, and my career involves organizational development. A lot of times an internal practitioner may actually only have one or two classes and not a lot of practical experience. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's a disadvantage. It's the pros and cons. That a lot of times an organization does not actually hire a highly trained organizational development specialist to be inside an organization. They'll often assign someone that is already within the organization to take on this role. May lack objectivity. It is a little more difficult to really look at various competing organizations, the environment from an external viewpoint when you're very much in an organization. There is a more strong likelihood for that internal practitioner to accept the organizational's current systems. In other words, they are more likely to fall in the trap, well, we've always done things this way, and maybe it just would be too traumatic to try to change. And sometimes they may lack the necessary power and authority. In other words, the stakeholders that are asking them to do what's right to help the organization change are also the same people generally, their upper management, that make decisions about their long-term careers, which means that they may have less authority and also may have been granted less power than an external consultant. So how can we balance these positives and negatives of the internal versus external practitioner? Well, that generally is done by an internal external practitioner team. So some of the most successful attempts at doing OD, especially long-term changes that are really changing an organization's structure or process, usually are done by an actual team where there is clearly identified internal practitioners who have been basically elevated to the level of task managers or project managers for the OD in the organization. But then they're also working in tandem with contracted external practitioners. Probably the most effective approach when organizations are willing to do it because you counterbalance both the positives and the negatives, the pros and cons of each approach. Basically, the partners bring complementary resources. Now, I would like to say that there is something to look for, and I've seen this myself. I have often been in these situations where I'm an external contracted OD professional being brought in as a practitioner. I'm assigned an internal person who's going to run basically the interventions internally. And I've had those relationships become very positive, where we work very well together, we're very complementary. But I've also been in situations where I'm seen as an unwanted external component. In other words, the internal person basically is like, why couldn't I just do this myself? Why are we having to bring in someone external? Don't you trust me? So sometimes, again, when you're doing a team approach, external and internal, do recognize there may need to be a little micro level of organizational development of building that team itself before just assuming it's going to gel into a complementary team of resources. So I briefly just want to talk about kind of conceptualizing OD practitioner styles. And practitioners will have a variety of styles. And a good way to just kind of model this is to ask yourself, what style do I fall into? And is that style what the organization currently needs? Because in almost all cases, when we're talking about organizational development or any interventions, we kind of want to think about the PE fit model, person, environment, fit. The best situation is usually found when you match the right person with the right environment to get good fit to result in productivity. So if an organization's environment is one that is relatively stable right now, so it's needing slow long-term changers, and you bring in someone that is an analyzer, and I'll talk about this graph in a little bit more, but an analyzer is someone that is very focused on task change, doesn't really care about morale, and wants to get things done, get things done, get things done. That may be a poor fit. That might be running into a situation where that person, the analyzer, that situation, very stable, becomes a poor fit because change may start to be being done simply for change's sake. So this is basically a 2x2 model, and the idea here is that there's two main things that any OD practitioner can focus on. The morale or the social aspect of the organization. So how do people actually feel about the organization? How committed are people to the organization? How much job satisfaction do they have? How much commitment do they have? Or effectiveness. So what are the processes? What are the structures? What are the productivity? What are the targets? And that OD practitioners can vary on these two dimensions. So someone that's low on morale and low on effectiveness, for instance, is a stabilizer. They're basically someone and that would be a good fit at that point if the organization is also fairly stable. So if there's no major problems with morale, there's no major problems with effectiveness, a stabilizer is basically going to be just looking at the situation and moving forward very slowly on small interventions, small changes, but also hopefully monitoring the situation. Someone that's very high in both morale and effectiveness, a pathfinder, is going to be trying to change the organization in both its structure and its process, but also in a way that increases morale and increases satisfaction. So people are going to be more energized, have higher morale, more engagement, while they actually also become more effective. So that's a big change agent. That's trying to change multiple aspects of the organization in a way that also positively impacts the employees within the organization. And then from those two extremes, we have the cheerleader, which is mainly focused on just morale. So this might be an organization that is quite honestly very effective. The productivity is high. It's got a good market share. There's no problems there. But for whatever reason, there may be some morale issues. So a cheerleader would be a good practitioner style. You're focusing on increasing the morale. Likewise, you might have an organization where morale is fine, but productivity is dropping. The market share is losing. That might be a situation where you'd want the analyzer. And finally, we kind of have that middle block, the blue block of the persuader. The persuader is often seen to be more of a kind of a mix between cheerleader and analyzer. It's not quite pathfinder, which is both. It's someone that's going back and forth between the two, cheerleader and analyzer. So we also want to talk about the readiness of the organization for OD at this phase. Key personnel first need to decide, obviously, that change is needed. What learning goals of OD are appropriate? So what are we actually trying to do within that organization? What's the cultural state of the client? Is it ready for OD? Who are the key people involved? And members prepared and oriented to OD. This is really just kind of a quick checklist that if you're either an internal or external practitioner, and we've moved past stage one. We basically have an organization that is ready for change, or at least acknowledges a change. This is more of the, okay, let's actually delineate out who are the key personnel that I'm dealing with that are driving this change. What are the learning goals of the OD? So what do we need to do to actually make OD work? What is the cultural state? Is that the first intervention that I'm doing? What are the key people that are going to be actually doing this intervention? And are those individuals actually prepared and oriented to the kind of OD model? So this is, again, we're moving from just hypothetical, what is the situation, to the first phases of let's start talking about what interventions are needed and who is going to be doing them. And the intervention itself is, well, it's coming between the members of the organization. It can be coming between individual members of each member in the organization. It can also be coming between the organization and members or within structures in the organization. The main thing I'm trying to communicate here is that an intervention is going to be something that either changes the interactions, the structure, the process, or the procedures of an organization, which means it's going to have a direct impact on any member that's involved in those structures, those processes, those policies. And the reason for the intervention is to create a change. So we want to identify kind of broadly, what is the problem? What do we plan to do to fix the problem? Who will that affect? And what does a positive change look like? So a reminder, interventions are a planned activity. So as we start to design the intervention in phase 2, we really want to consider it in these elements of what is the actual intervention? How do we operationally define it? What are we actually going to do? Is there the support for that change to happen, for that intervention to occur? Who will that intervention directly impact and indirectly impact? And finally, what is our bar for that intervention being successful? And that's making an intervention a planned activity. So external practitioners usually intervene through top managers, internal practitioners are usually a little bit more focused on middle level management. So an external practitioner is usually going to have a fairly high level direct contact where they're going to be helping top managers to kind of conceptualize these broad issues and then suggest packaged interventions, which then the management itself will take to the people that are actually going to be basically the boots on the ground. Internal practitioners are usually a little bit lower in the system. They're closer to those boots on the ground, but the process is going to be the same. So the practitioner's role in the intervention, we operate on the belief that the team is a basic building block. So that's the first thing to think about, is that OD generally is fairly team focused. So one of the first things that we want to do is, what is our team as a practitioner in OD? So who are we directly working with? Who's our work team? Who's our task team? And that will often involve our contacts, so the people that are driving the change, but also the front line, or not the front line, the very top level of the people that are going to be implementing these interventions. We want to be concerned with how our processes occur. So we're really wanting to think about, how does processes occur in this organization, and what will be the impact of these interventions on the processes of the organization. This is a good time to again come back to that idea of open systems, kind of thinking about, will this intervention be targeting various parts of that open systems model, either inputs, throughputs, outputs, the feedback loop, or the environment itself. The practitioner should not be taking control. Practitioners are not managers. They're not decision makers. They're basically architects and engineers. And it's important to kind of realize that the real goal is that we are trying to set up a situation where we will become less and less important. That's very easy as an external practitioner. So as an external practitioner, there is actually a finite contract of when my job is over. As an internal practitioner, it's more of thinking of each intervention as its own arc, that the success of that intervention means that it no longer needs the practitioner to keep it moving, to keep it going. It's stuck by itself, and it's now become a set part of the organization, allowing that internal practitioner to now move on to a new intervention or a new project to be working on. So the practitioner's role in intervention is to assist the client to lead to a lasting solution that effectively means that that individual intervention or that individual solution no longer actually needs the OD practitioner to be involved, unless, of course, it needs to be changed again.